We're covering classifications or types of bones just based on their shape. And we did this with other types of tissue. Remember, there's 4 types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. And we look at connective tissue. There's 3 types: connective tissue proper. We learned connective tissue fluid, and now supporting. And supporting includes our cartilage and bone. So we're on to bone now, but we start by just naming how do we describe them and compare them to others based on their shape or type. We started to do this with epithelial tissue because we named based on cell layer and the shape of the cells. Remember, we talked about cuboidal, columnar. So we do the same thing with bones because we try to compare them, especially when we start to learn how they grow and how they develop through osteogenesis and bone development, which is ossification. So our classification of types of bone. Simply put, one is long relative to another one is short. So we're comparing them relative to other bones. So our long bones include things like the femur, the humerus, the tibia, the fibula, relative to bones like the tarsals, and here are the carpals. So there's 8 carpals here that we'll come back to naming them in a future video, but these are short bones relative to the long ones. So you have short bones. And then we get into things like flat bones. So flat bones, I showed 2 examples here. First, the sternum is a flat bone. This bone takes about 20-25 years for it to completely all fuse together. And then we have our ribs. We have different types of ribs. We have true and false and floating. And they curve, but relative to other bones, they're still flat. So they may curve, but relative to a long and a short, they're flatter bones. Okay. And then irregular, they're all over the place. Some of my facial bones, so my face is irregular, and my vertebrae. So this is stacking 3 vertebrae here, but they're not long, they're not short, they're not flat, they're kind of all over the place, so we call them irregular. And then sesamoid bone. The primary example any text will give for a sesamoid bone is the patella. And sesamoid bone means sesame, like it looks like a sesame seed. And this is looking at the kneecap or patella. And it's going to be surrounded by other types of tissue. So I'll have other connective tissues in our connective tissue proper that will cover over the top of this, so it's actually embedded in other types of tissue. This makes it a sesamoid bone. We see this also in our hands and our feet, but the primary example is going to be your patella. And then sutural bone. So I have dense fibrous tissue that helps connect all of my cranial bones. And when I look at facial, we'll come back to sutures as well. But there's sutural, and it's the boundaries of each of these bones as they come together and fuse. And so later videos, we'll talk about fontanelles and how we see those early on in development. And then sutures. And suture bones are just these tiny little fragments that help create the actual skull or cranium. And these connections we'll learn as we describe how the bone develops and comes together. So sutural bones. And then lastly, pneumatized bone. Some texts don't talk about pneumatized bone, but this is an example of the ethmoid bone. So the ethmoid bone comes right in top of my nose, and it'll show up on the inside the cranial floor when I open up the cranium. But a pneumatized is essentially, it's an irregular bone, but the difference is it has a lot of air sacs to it. And this helps with like our sinuses and draining when we think about just getting into our nasal cavity. But we also use it to breathe. So as air goes through the different holes that we'll describe with the ethmoid bone, it helps us stimulate the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve number 1, for olfaction or smell. So pneumatized by definition, meaning it has more air sacs to it. We'll see in other types of bones, the temporal bone has a landmark called the mastoid process. That has air sacs to it. So it's unique in the sense on how it's developed. So I have long, short, flat, irregular, sesamoid, sutural, and pneumatized. These are shapes, and we describe them as classifications of bones or types of bones. And now later in the next video, we'll talk about the makeup of bone. How do we get to this point where we see these types?